Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another bit of Total War, Warhammer 2, Quick Match gameplay. This time around we are playing as the Vampire Counts against the forces of Brettonia on the map Arnheim. So this is definitely not one of my favorite maps. It's very corridory, very kind of limited in room to maneuver. But nonetheless, I did want to try out a build, and I've definitely been on a bit of a flyer kick lately. Just ever since trying out some of those Wood Elf builds with the heavy Forest Dragon comps, I did want to give a shot, or more of a shot, to these sorts of flyer heavy builds. And you can see here, I did decide to bring the Red Duke, thinking that if I was going up against Brettonia, Elsif could of course be useful if my opponent decided to go flyer heavy himself. He decided to bring Lewin or Bordelot, and obviously, even if you're trying to assassinate the Fey Enchantress or something, it's a decent enough choice. He also does have, of course, Foe Seeker, so decent mobility, Raised Dead, and Invocation of Neck, so some okay magic, and you do get a free Breath Attack and Hunger, of course, and the usual sort of equipment that you get with the dragon. He also does have, I do believe, a Cloud of Flies, which is a pretty cool little AoE melee attack debuff, -5 melee attack. So really pretty potent, and definitely makes this guy pretty nasty against enemy targets, or against enemy troops. He definitely can definitely dish out quite a bit of hurt, and I did bring two Terrorgeists alongside him. You can see so very heavy air contingent, and then finally a Vampire of Shadows coming in with fairly stripped down, only coming in with Melkos, Mystifying Miasma, Enfeebling Foe, Immortal Will, and Smoke and Mirrors. So very heavy air contingent. Well over half of my resources have gone into this sort of mob of flyers, and the main reason is that I figure that if my opponent goes flyer with some flyers, I can knock those out pretty quickly. If my opponent goes with cav heavy, I might be able to kind of isolate them, shut them down, and annihilate them piecemeal. And of course, Terrorgeists do have very solid melee stats. They're very tanky. They've got well over 5,700 HP. Poison damage, they've got armor piercing, bonus versus large, all that sort of stuff, and of course a breath attack, so and regen, so you have a pretty high power there. For the rest of my army, front line is all Graveguard, except for the single unit of the Königstein Stalkers here. No Sternsmen. Like I mentioned before, I really didn't have the money to spend on many fancy units. Graveguard basically outtrades anything the Brettonians put on the field, including Foot Squires. They'll trade pretty efficiently with those. I'm not entirely sure if they win, but it's a very, very close fight. And against anything else the Brettonian infantry might bring, they'll beat them. Königstein Stalkers are basically just the poor man's Graveguard, and they do apply poison, which means that whatever frontline fight is going on here, this Graveguard will probably be getting a little bit of poison support in there. Finally, hidden back in the trees, as far back as I could, kind of nestled here in the forest, I do have the Feasters in the Dusk, and I think these are actually a really great unit. They're definitely kind of a hidden gem, I think, in the Undead roster. They do have Stalk and Vanguard deployment. Their stats otherwise are pretty atrocious. You can see fairly low HP. They are pretty quick. They do have poison and pretty high weapon strength and decent enough melee stats. But really their main niche is that they have Stalk, they have Vanguard deployed, there's a lot of them, and they can really, really dish out the hurt to squishy infantry. And so that means they can shut down backlines, they can flank up enemy light infantry, they can destroy artillery pieces, all that sort of stuff. For my opponent, a pretty standard, I think, Brettonia build, though a very interesting front line, mostly in how motley and all over the place it is. My opponent did bring a Fey Enchantress, a pretty standard pick, coming in with the Flesh to Stone, Earthblood, Dwellers Below, which is a bit of a surprise. You don't see that very often anymore. No Regrowth. Arcane Conduit, of course, Favor of the Fey, and the Chalice of Potions. She also does have the Mist of the Lady, which of course is an AoE damage and melee attack debuff. Now, Flesh to Stone, I think is definitely can be a decent choice against Vampire Counts, especially if you're worried about, say, Blood Knights, because if you buff the armor on these guys, the Blood Knights don't do that much AP, so you can definitely get some value that way. For the rest of my opponent's army, he does have a front line of Men-at-Arms with shields and normal Men-at-Arms, backed up by a single Grail Relic, so giving a little bit of that extra morale and immunity psychology. Foot Squires here, the Foot Squires will trade, as we mentioned before, somewhat okay with Graveguard, though they have much less. I actually didn't realize they have over 1,000 less HP than them, which is pretty crazy. So maybe not even that well. But a Foot Squire is definitely not going to have, or the only unit in here that can really trade. Two Peasant Bowmen with Fire Arrows are actually going to be decent. All of these flyers up here do have regen, so they will be taking extra damage from the Peasant Bowmen. At the same time, though, the Peasant Bowmen have minimal armor piercing, and they are inaccurate, so they're going to struggle to even hit the Terrorgeists and get through that 80 armor on these units, since all of them have, except the Red Duke, have 80 armor, and the Red Duke, who's the only one who doesn't, actually has built-in missile resist of 25%. For the rest of my opponent's army, some Men-at-Arms with polearms and spears to protect against large. Obviously, these guys can once again tie down and beat down Terrorgeist a little bit. And then a backline of 3 Grail Knights and a single unit of Grail Guardians in the center, really forming the heart of the formation. So you can see I'm kind of trying to be cheeky here, trying to get a few breaths off on these Grail Knights. I don't actually get all my casts off, and I'm only going to get 1 here. You can see a little bit of breath. Knocks out 5 models, which is definitely not bad, because they were pretty tightly packed. And of course, the Brettonians can't get these sorts of units back. Unfortunately, you can see over there the other breath attack largely misses, only gets 1 model. You can see fire arrows are coming in hot and heavy. Anytime the frontline clash has begun, you can see the Graveguard here being plowed into by the Grail Guardians, but everywhere else, it's a pretty even fight with the Graveguard trading pretty efficiently with their opposites. And especially once charge bonuses wear off, the Graveguard will really be in their element. Over here in the meantime, you can see these men-at-arms with shields are going to fall apart. Despite Flesh to Stone going down, they simply don't have the stats to defend themselves. And of course, with Fear and Terror kicking in, they will fall apart very quickly as they're too far from the Grail Relic. And what I do here is I do drop the zombies here on the bowman, which is actually going to prevent this cavalry from coming into support. My opponent's definitely going to have a rough time getting the cav here, and I isolate the Grail Guardians, instantly hitting him with an enfeebling foe. Actually, the Overcast variant, so it's they're very, very squishy. You can see they're down to 35 models already, and they're getting torn to shreds. You can see losing another 4 models there. Their morale is dropping like a rock, and they are getting annihilated. In the meantime, over here, the Feasters in the Dusk are going to get spotted, which is going to force my opponent to pull back. You can see Malkoth's Mystify Miasma going down to the Grail Guardians, trying to time down, and I'm sticking in here as long as I can. I know the Grail Guardians will do, or Grail Knights will do quite a bit of damage to the Terrorgeist, but I really want to get rid of as many of these annoying Grail Guardians as I possibly can. In the meantime, these men-at-arms have fallen back. You can see the Graveguard are just doing such a great job. They really do mop these troops up. Over here, the Foot Squires are going to rout because they do get flanked thanks to their surrounding men-at-arms collapsing. It's really only here in the heart of things that they're holding out, thanks to the favor of the Fae and the fact that they're fighting Königstein Stalkers. Over here, the Feasters and Dust do get caught, but this means some of my opponent's cavalry has been pulled back. These guys who had to cycle away from the zombies are struggling a little bit. You can see these zombies and the Graveguard just tie my opponent down. Unfortunately, he does get a lovely surround here on my Vampire of Shadows, and this is a big problem for me. Vampires do not have good melee defense. But you can see my breath attacks here just devastating these Grail Knights that are trying to surround my Vampire of Shadows. But definitely a big problem for me. The simple fact is the Vampire does not have the best survivability here. She's getting annihilated incredibly quickly, and I really make a big mistake here by not supporting her immediately, trying to get these greedy breath attacks off, which do devastate my opponent's heavy cav, but it does mean that this Vampire is going to get annihilated. And now I do dive in, getting some nasty rear charge into these Grail Knights, but unfortunately it's too little too late. As I do try to make a last-ditch sort of cast there, but too little too late. I do get an enfeebling foe here on these Grail Knights, which is going to make them super susceptible, and you can see the Flyers just annihilate these guys. In the meantime, the backline is very much compromised for my opponent. You can see some Graveguard here getting mopped up by Grail Knights, but these other Graveguard are slaughtering the Spearmen. The Feasters in the Dusk are running down the poor routing Peasant Bows. They're just very quick on their feet with 42 speed. They're actually comparable to quite a few of the faster factions infantry units, and they'll actually even out-trade men-at-arms with shields here. Obviously with their poison they just have such a huge advantage. In the meantime, everywhere else, Graveguard just slaughtering their way through pitiful men-at-arms. You can see here the Grail Guardians do dive in, just trying to tie down this Flyer force, but they really don't stand a chance. Invocation of the Heck has gone down, healing some of these Graveguard. At this point, my opponent's army is simply going to collapse, and my opponent calls it a game. So, really a pretty potent force. You can see the Terrorgeist here. It was very much all about surgical strikes and knocking out specific targets as quickly as possible. Terrorgeist racking up 35, 33 kills, the Red Duke at 47, and the Vampire of Shadows at 9, all of which was basically targeted on the Brettonian heavy cav. Thanks to this sort of isolation with the use of zombies and Graveguard and debuffs, I was able to slowly but surely pick apart my opponent's heavy cavalry, and that's really critical. If you can get a big mob of, say, Terrorgeists and a dragon on a single unit of cavalry, prevent the rest of the cavalry from helping, it's huge. It means you can annihilate them. As you can see here, slowly over time, for basically just the loss of a single Vampire of Shadows here, 3 units of heavy cav were annihilated, almost to a man. And honestly, I could have saved the Vampire of Shadows if I had been a little more on top of on top of supporting her and been a little more prudent, rather than trying to get all those breaths off. 1 unit of Graveguard did get annihilated. It's just to be expected. It's no big loss, and they trashed the men-at-arms pretty handily. Obviously, some of the men-at-arms did okay against the Königstein Stalkers, especially because they got a favor of the Fae, but otherwise, really, men-at-arms cannot hold the Graveguard. Graveguard is a very good choice against Brettonia, and honestly, I'll keep saying it, they are one of the best infantry in the game for their costs, and especially against Brettonia, who really just doesn't have the tools to deal with them. They manhandle the men-at-arms with polearms, they manhandle the spears, the men-at-arms, and even Foot Squires don't really stand a chance against them, because they do have a significant edge in HP and melee defense, and of course, Foot Squires don't have the best of armor, and once the charge bonuses are expended on both units, the Graveguard just has very good grinding stats. The Peasant Bows are not a bad choice, I think, for my opponent. Definitely not a bad idea, but they definitely got shut down pretty hard by this sort of build. Definitely, if my opponent had been trying to kind of deal with this, I think that he needs to not overcommit his Grail Guardians. Definitely you want to have your cavalry within, not necessarily on top of each other, but in a position where they could support each other relatively easily. But unfortunately, my opponent just didn't have those tools. I also didn't go try to isolate the Fey Enchanters, and I think that's definitely something you also can go for if you feel like your opponent's caster isn't too much of a threat. Obviously, I didn't feel the Fey Enchanters was much of a threat in this situation. With only Earthblood and spells that can't really KO my most important units, I wasn't really worried about her. I didn't really care about gooning her out. I really just wanted to shut down the heavy cap because that was where this core of my opponent's army was. Nonetheless, a great game to my opponent. I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below. If you have any additional comments or criticism or anything like that, be sure to share those, and I will respond as soon as I can. As usual, guys, I do appreciate you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.